Good afternoon and welcome to the 31st Orkney International Science Festival online. This afternoon, it is my pleasure to introduce the first of three memorial lectures on three great figures of Northern archaeology. Today's talk is given by Beverley Ballin Smith, prehistoric pottery specialist of Guard Archaeology Limited. Beverley will deliver a presentation on the achievements of John Hedges, who established the North of Scotland Archaeological Services in 1977, one of the first of its kind in the country. His work on the Tomb of the Eagles, re-examining the Broch of Gurness, and new excavations at the Bu and Howe farm in Stromness greatly enhanced our knowledge of the Neolithic in Orkney. John Hedges sadly died in January this year. Beverley will pay tribute to him and his accomplishments, speaking as a close colleague of his and having worked with him on the site at Howe and at Gurness. John Hedges did much to illuminate our understanding of Brochs in particular, whose origins were the subject of intense speculation before he set them on a scientific footing. Beverley is also a member of the University of Glasgow Archaeological Unit, which carried out excavations of the Neolithic tomb at Cranted in Kirkwall. And she also undertook an Udall excavation on North Uist. All three archaeologists who are the subject of our memorial lecture series were fellows of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. And I will now hand over to one of the vice presidents of that society, Dr. Heather James. And she will say a few words before the talk begins.
Thank you, Alistair. Firstly, I'd like to warmly welcome all of you to this lecture from Beverley Ballin Smith, which I'm sure will be a fitting memorial to John Hedges, who was a long-standing fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. I would also like to thank the organisers for the opportunity for the Society to take part and to highlight our work. We were originally founded back in 1780 and now have over 2,700 fellows spread across the world. Today, our main aims are to provide an independent voice on Scottish heritage issues, to provide grants for new research projects, and to encourage the enjoyment of Scotland's past. Two highlights of our work include Digit, the online heritage hub, which promotes events that are open to everyone, and also the Scottish Archaeological Research Framework, or SCARF, which is an online resource that brings together all the latest research. We also have a vast number of publications which are freely available, and we host public lectures and conferences. So I would encourage you, everyone, to have a look at our webpage, and to anyone who's not already a fellow, please join. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Heather. If you do have any questions for Beverley during the presentation, then please post them in the YouTube live chat. And so without further ado, I'll hand over to Beverley.
Thank you very, very much, Alistair. And thank you all for tuning in this afternoon. I believe that not many of you will have heard of John Hedges, fewer of you will have met him, but who was John? In our next slide is an image of him in about 1978. And this is about the time I first met him, and also Heather, who has just spoken. John, as it has already been said, was an archaeologist who established NOSAS, the North of Scotland Archaeology Service, in about 1977. But he first came to Orkney in about 1972, and he was working with Colin Renfrew at the excavation at Shetland in Kirkwall. And he liked it so much that he returned the following year to work at Liddell Burnt Mound in South Ronaldsay. He made South Ronaldsay his base, and he worked on Bronze Age sites as well as the late Neolithic tomb of the Eagles with Ronnie Simonson. Next slide, please. The setting up of what became the sizable organisation of NOSAS came next, and it was mainly concerned with rescue projects that were funded by the Scottish Development Department, as they were called at that time. And John and his team undertook projects at Bu and Howe in Bursey and also Bu Broch near Stromness. And the picture on the right-hand side is actually John holding the ladder, and I think that is Bu Broch. Following the successful excavation of Bu, John also started the excavation of the Broch at Howe farm the same autumn in 1978, and he directed it for the next 2 years. Now, that wasn't just all that John did, because during this time, he started new endeavours, such as the reappraisal and reinterpretation of structures and finds at the Broch of Gurness. He researched Orkney's Brochs in general, and he wrote up the excavation of Isbister, and that's the Tomb of the Eagles, as you can see in the left-hand image there. Most of his books were published after he left Orkney, with Bu and Gurness and the Brochs of Orkney in 1987. Now, he wasn't the only one dealing with Brochs. There was Dr. Ewan Mackay, who was probably one of Scotland's foremost researchers in Broch studies, and he reviewed Bu, Gurness and the Brochs of Orkney, seen in our next slide. And he reviewed this work for the journal Antiquity. Now, I'm just going to quote him briefly. Ewan said that John Hedges has a reputation for hard work, for the prompt and detailed publication of complicated excavations and surveys, and for challenging accepted views in Scottish archaeology. He was also largely responsible for the resurrection of the prehistory of the Orkney Islands in the subsequent few years. Now, I'm just going to follow on with another little bit that Ewan mentioned. John believes that his new discoveries have made redundant most, if not all, previous work on Scottish Brochs. And that included Ewan's own work. And Ewan went on to say that at a conference of Brochs in Orkney in 1986, John gave a lecture and he denounced the century-old view of Brochs, and he thought it was bogus and largely ill-founded. Now, those words were shocking to somebody like Ewan Mackay, who'd spent his life working on Brochs and following his own research, usually from a very traditionalist point of view. So his and John's views on Brochs, right from the beginning of John getting involved with Broch studies and their origins, they differed. And some of this will be explored in this talk. To John, the Broch has always felt to be Scotland's archaeological showpiece, as seen in the next slide. The Broch was always viewed in isolation. There was little reference to any other monuments or features outside it. And even though this is not the best slide of Musa, it's an old slide, but the best that I could find. You can see in the grass to either side of the Broch and just in front of it, in the foreground, there was an outline of stone structures and a rampart. And these are the sorts of things that John had thought, well, you know, nobody's ever been interested in. The antiquarians never bothered with them. And John further researched the history of Broch archaeology in Scotland. And he looked at the work of Joseph Anderson, who synthesized and consolidated the state of knowledge on Scottish Brochs and elevated their status. It was Joseph Anderson in 1881 who described them as circular defensive towers with a single protected entrance and an enclosed courtyard. And that's what they were. They weren't anything else outside. The height of the few remaining that were towers, Musa being one, and such as the next slide, which is Duntelve in Inverness, the height of these were achieved by an inner and outer skin of masonry. And you can see that on the left-hand side of the slide. And these skins were joined by lintels. And you can see them looking like ladders going up the inside face of the broch here. Anderson thought the bases of the brochs were often solid, but with chambers entered from the courtyard. And I think we have one on the right-hand side at the bottom of this image. And because they recognized Roman finds that were associated with, and I won't say excavation, with the clearing out of these brochs, Anderson dated them to the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. And that was the prevailing thought about brochs for almost 100 years. It's a very long time. In the next slide, we have the broch of Musa. And Ewan Mackay thought this actually exemplified some of what he thought about brochs. Now, Ewan had worked himself on the broch of Dunmore Vole in Tiree, and he'd studied the works of Sir Lindsay Scott in the 1940s and of Hamilton in the 1950s and 60s, the Alshoff and Clickerman, both in Shetland. So Ewan's views differed slightly from the antiquarian view. He considered them as hollow walled towers owned by aristocratic chieftains, such as the one here at Mid Howe, and with its internal furnishings seen in our next slide. He thought that these brochs were introduced to Orkney from the south in the Middle Iron Age, it was round about the Roman period. And there was also the suggestion that they sprang forth fully formed. And Ewan thought they were all erected over a very short space of time by itinerant specialist architect builders. And the picture of Mid Howe, excavated in the 1930s, typified his view. But it wasn't the view that John Hedges agreed with. In the next slide, please. By the middle of the 20th century, the origin of the brochs was considered a problem. The word had come from Lindsay Scott's paper in 1947, and where he thought that little was actually known about brochs, but he suggested their function and structure might not have been as uniform as supposed. He thought many of them were farmhouses, and but that was clearly not the function of the broch of Borwick as we have here. So Lindsay Scott retained some of the old thinking, but gently moved it forward. And I think this is one of the seminal papers that was the starting point for John Hedges to re-examine what brochs were, how they originated, and what about their architecture. Now, John knew about the broch of Gurness, seen in the next slide. John came along in the mid to late 1970s with the intention of questioning these antiquarian core assumptions of what a broch was. Now, for those of you that remember, archaeology in the 70s was all about rescuing sites, and the activities associated with that and the new archaeology. John was really in the middle of all that. He was influenced by it, and he questioned. He did a lot of questioning. He didn't believe each broch was the same. There were no blueprints to say how they were supposed to be built, apart from the circularity of the structure and the single entrance. Nor did John believe that they were erected over a very short space of time. His remarks on the bogus and ill-founded traditional ideas in 1985 did not go well with traditionalists, as I've already said. But perhaps it wasn't so much what he said as how he said it. And as I said, it didn't go well, down well with Ewan MacCallum, and there remained a tension with them, between them, always. In the next slide, John Hedges' views on, specifically on the Brochs of Orkney during the first 6 decades of the 20th century, what they were that they had not been excavated with the right intentions. Here we've got a picture of the Broch of Gurness, and the main idea behind excavating what was a very large mound of stone was to collect relics to enhance museum collections. Broch mounds were not excavated with regard to stratigraphy. The excavators were looking for things that they could recognize. They recognized a large circular stone building, but they didn't really recognize the things that they had dug through to get through to the large stone building in the center of the image. They didn't record things very well. They had notes, and as the Broch of Gurness and Mid Howe were excavated together in the 1930s, letters were exchanged between the 2 excavators, but they never left any notes as to what they were finding. However, there were plans, because Hewitt Craw was a skilled planner. The techniques of excavation were poor. I've already used the word cleared out once, and this was what happened. These are words from letters by Richardson to Hewitt Craw to others. They found the circular tower, they cleared around it, they cleared out the inside. And often small structures and walls found beneath the topsoil were not comprehended. They were just shoveled away. And you can see the coastline and the cliffs in the bottom left-hand corner of the image. And this is where they were cleared out to. This is where the loose rubble went, with the structures as well. And the other thing that was never really fully understood were the ramparts. And you can see that Gurness has some beautiful, well-kept ramparts around it. And we'll come back to those in a few moments. So Gurness was never fully published. And John Hedges thought it was about time that he did something about this. And this is why he started to look at Gurness and the Brochs of Orkney to try and understand them a lot better. He said something quite interesting. John Hedges said that considering the legacy of sites like Gurness and Mid Howe and others, the legacy is voluminous, but of actually limited worth. And we're still left with this dichotomy today of fabulous, wonderful structures open to the public, but what do we actually know about them? John was also concerned about the understanding of the outbuildings. You can see on this side, they're beautifully laid out, positioned around the Broch, and also in the next slide, where you can see them from the ground, looking at the Broch Tower. But they were also encountered at sites such as Lingro, dug by Petrie, and at Mid Howe. Not as extensive, well, we don't know that, but not as well preserved as those here at Gurness. All these structures outside the Broch were assumed to be secondary to it. But subsequent research by John Hedges, myself and others, these surrounding dwellings are considered contemporary with the Broch Tower, where planning and symmetry were involved. External contemporary structures such as those seen on the next slide, here also at Gurness. You can see they were accessed from outside the settlement through a passage and an entrance across the defences that led directly up to the Broch doorway and around the Broch. So each house had access from this main passage and again from round about the Broch. And this led John to think that really the Broch Tower had evolved in some cases, not just to be a Broch Tower with some sort of settlement in front of it, but it was a nucleated, defended settlement, or perhaps even a fortified village with a Broch at its heart. Now, John was also interested in why there was this general neglect about the defences in relationship to Brochs. And as you can see in this next slide, where there are two images of those at Gurness, they're some of the most impressive defences, Iron Age defences on Orkney. I've already shown you the Broch of Borwick, and that had natural defences on the peninsula, on the cliffs where it is situated. But when we come to Howe, you will see that Howe is very different. He was also interested how the Brochs and their defences fitted in with other sites and in the bigger picture, where we've got promontory forts and the blockhouses, for example, in Shetland. So where did they fit into the story of Brochs? What was their origins? How did they start? He also wanted to know why did we have defences? What were they there for? So he reckoned there were about 20 Brochs on Orkney with outer defences, such as these at Gurness. And therefore, there were about 20 Brochs that had external settlements. And this is a topic that John turned to next. In the next slide, he looked at Bu. Now, this was just a fortuitous event that happened. John had set up Nosas. The farmer wanted this mound, not a high mound, as you can see from this picture. He wanted this mound shifted. It was in his way. And Historic Scotland, who funded this excavation, asked John to undertake it. And he did so over 5 weeks. Now, 5 weeks is not a long time when you are looking at buildings that are built of stone in a stone mound. It's a complicated excavation, and John managed it in that very short time. Now, the funders, Historic Scotland, became alarmed that it was a Broch, because they knew they were going to have to fund it for an awfully long time if it was a Broch. And so they restricted the aims of the excavation of this one. So John had to make plans of the original floor and any contemporary structures, including any of the external defences. He was to retrieve any stratified finds, any environmental evidence, and to try to date the structures by radiocarbon dating. Next slide, please. And you can see in this slide, this is the centre of what John called Bu Broch. It had a thick wall surrounding the interior, and it stood no more than 2 meters high. And it had extra cladding on the outside, and I can see from this photograph, it had actually extra cladding of a stone wall on the inside. And it was very much like what John had experienced at Scatness with Colin Renfrew, and also the roundhouse pier wall a bit later on. It didn't have any guard cells, it had no intramural cells, no bar holes in the doorway, no outbuildings except a later earth house. And you can just see that slightly on the very left edge of the picture in the centre there. It had no ramparts, it had no ditches, and it was dated to about the 7th century BC, very much like the Scatness roundhouse itself. So we're talking about differences in the age of Brochs from what the antiquarians thought. Now, I've already mentioned that Bu was not a prominent mound, and this suggested to John Hedges that there was a sampling bias when it came to identifying Brochs. Everybody looked at the tall mounds that are in the countryside or in Orkney, and so nobody really bothered with these low ones to the same extent, and the potential there was very great, according to John. But one thing that puzzled him, and it puzzled him for a long time, was whether Bu was actually a broch or a defended roundhouse. Now, some of John's questions were not answered by the excavations here at Bu, but at the same year, the same autumn that he finished Bu, he started on Howe, as seen in this next slide. You can instantly see this is a very, very different sort of settlement, much more like Gurness, but in a sense, very complicated. Howe was to answer more of John's questions, but posed many others. And this image shows many, many things. In the center, the broch is not just one broch, it's two brochs and a roundhouse. You've got, yes, the outer circular structure is the larger broch. The inner bit that's standing proud is the earlier broch, and inside that was a roundhouse. Very complicated. Now, surrounding, you can see the surrounding houses, creating a little village. You can see just about towards the left-hand side of the picture and also to the south that there are bits of the defences which were being excavated. But this image is absolutely phenomenal to me. I've looked at it again for the first time in many years, and I think it really encapsulated the complexity of Brochs studies that John Hedges was trying to get to grips with. Now, how I think still remains unique, and that it not only shows this overlying or overlaying of structures of different periods of use, from the earliest roundhouse to the big second broch, but in order to achieve the information we got from this site, we took it away. Everything you see in that picture disappeared, and that was due to us, the archaeologists. Now, when John first began to excavate the Broch of Howe and all its contemporary structures, the mound, which was quite a large one, next slide please, once he took off the turf, it was a mound of rubble that accumulated over the top of the broch. And this had to be meticulously excavated, not just shoveled away as in the past. Now, I know it takes a practiced eye, but perhaps you can see in the rubble in this image that there are several circular or semicircular curved walls representing bits of farm structures and other buildings that were late Iron Age or Pictish in date. Now, because of John Hedges coming with fresh eyes to Orkney Brochs and his improved recording methods and how he understood stone structures, we had to excavate this rubble carefully to find out what happened at the end of the broch when these new smaller structures were constructed into it. It was a very complicated process, but revealed a wealth of information that helped John and ourselves understand what life was like after Brochs disappeared. In the next slide, I think John realised that Howe had actually exceeded his expectations The arrangement of the interior Broch furnishings to 2 stories high. And the next slide shows the top of these furnishings. And you can see that they were corbelled. They were, as we excavated them, they were extremely dangerous. But they showed that the interior of the Broch had an upper corbelled story, which was an open fronted gallery. But for safety reasons, we had to take them down. In the next slide, you can see the original floor of the Broch. You see the compartments at the top of the picture, which had the upper story. And this picture encapsulated also the variety of internal arrangements. John Hedges had stressed that no 2 Broch interiors were the same. And because we excavated this carefully, we could see that there was a pattern, that things were clear and clarified, but we couldn't quite understand the internal staircase, and that's seen on the towards the right. And then you learn more that something like Howe was not a structure that was ever going to stand and last. It had instability problems. But I want you to just have a look at the gaping hole at the foot of the stairs, because that provided access into the next slide, actually, which is an earth house. And this was found in the floor, beneath the floor of both Brochs and the roundhouse. And the masonry here was already 2,000 years old when Iron Age people came to occupy what became the Howe Brochs and the mound. We don't know what this was for. We have what we call wells inside other Iron Age sites, such as Gurness and also the cairns. And this structure, this earth house, is very much like what was outside the Broch at Bu. But are they what we think they are? They're enigmatic. Did they have special meaning? Did they have special uses? And it showed to John Hedges that, there's more to Brochs than just the tower. And the meaning of some of these structures really hasn't been fully explored. And I think perhaps that was one thing John was thinking of doing. But at Howe, in the next slide, we can see another complexity, that some of the buildings around the Broch survived over 2 meters high. Did they survive like that when Brochs were excavated in the Antiquarian period? We don't know. So the complexity of the plans and the excavations that people did late 19th century, early 20th century, we cannot explain what we see or what they experienced at the time, because the record was very limited. And I think, and probably John did too, that much of the survival that we got at Howe was missed at other places because of the collapse of stonework. In the next slide, I just want to show you little bits of the earlier Broch, how this one had guard cells either side of the entrance. And if we have the next slide as well, we can see it also had an internal staircase, landing, and intramural staircase taking access up to the wall head. But this Broch had fallen down. Bigger Broch was built around it, but did not use the staircases that we see here now. So Brochs were complicated, and they weren't just a quick, here's a plan, let's build a Broch. There were architectural developments, there was expediency, there there were problems, and people during the Iron Age must have experimented with these large stone buildings in order to find a solution to why they wanted them. Today, there's been a wealth of information gleaned from Howe, and I hope it has helped target research over the last few decades. But today, several researchers are exploring Iron Age buildings on Orkney. I would like to highlight one, and that's in the next slide. And this one is the cairns in South Ronaldsay, and it's been carried out by Martin Carruthers from the UHI in Kirkwall. And Martin has found this large round Iron Age structure. It's got later structures, it's got an enclosing ditch, contemporary buildings, an earthhouse or souterrain, and probably evidence of earlier occupation on the site. The question is it a broch, is it a roundhouse, or is it both? So there's still questions, there's still many, many questions about these structures. Now, Martin has recently highlighted the well within the centre of the broch courtyard, similar to that found at Gurness and other sites. And he posed the question of what actually was its function. So he will be grappling with that. And this site too shows or demonstrates the complexity of the round broch or broch-like structures, the size of the actual excavated area, the fact it is a large-scale excavation, and it also requires large amounts of money to excavate it. Now, other recent interventions by researchers on Orkney include the roundhouses and other structures at the now of Swandrow on Rousey and the now of Ski on Westry. All these interventions are beginning to move broch studies forward on Orkney. New techniques are producing new results, new evidence, but also more questions. In the next slide, we see John sometime in the early 1980s. And although he completed the publication of the Bu, Brochs and the Bu, Gurness and the Brochs of Orkney, and aimed to write a definitive broch book, he never had the opportunity to return to the subject, and much of his subsequent thinking on brochs is limited to the rare interview. If nothing else, he got us to expand our thinking outside the broch. He questioned terminology and concepts, later taken up by Professor Ian Armitt, who coined the terms Atlantic roundhouses and complex roundhouses to encompass structures that were broch-like, but not necessarily brochs. John wanted us to think about the development of building traditions from the late Bronze Age roundhouses and interrogate their dating. He wanted us to look at regional developments and differences, the complexity of settlements and of society in the Iron Age, and to understand better what was going on. And he also wanted, through the evidence of environmental, social and economic factors, to explore what caused defended settlements to come into being. At the time he was thinking of this was new territory. But that territory has now become standard archaeological practice. And John, I think, would have been absolutely delighted about this. In the next slide, John is seen here in 2008 when he returned to Orkney to help celebrate Ronnie Simonson's MBE award for his work at the Tomb of the Eagles. John had just started to initiate another archaeological project was the recording of the archaeological sites of South Parish, South Ronaldsay, and latterly with local archaeologist Barry Constantine. But I last saw John in 2019, and he didn't remember what he'd done on Orkney. And as we talked, he was surprised, very surprised and unbelieving that he had achieved so much and published so much. Although he had visited the cairns some years previously, he would not have appreciated how he'd influenced Broch research today. I find that very sad. And John died in January this year, aged 72. And I think we're going to miss his thinking about Brochs, but there's nothing we can do about that. Next slide, please. It's difficult to evaluate John Hedges' work and thinking in this presentation, but I leave the last comment to Martin Carruthers. You can see at the bottom of this slide. And I'd like to thank you all for listening, and thank you, Howie, for suggesting this talk, and for asking me to do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Beverley. That was very interesting. I haven't really thought very much about Brochs as an interconnected sort of archaeological area very much before, but I'm sure Heather has, and I will invite her to start the question and answer session, which will include some of the questions you've been sending in on YouTube.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Beverley. That was really fascinating, and especially personal for me, considering I was very briefly dug at the How of How while it was in the early stages when we were digging what we thought then was the Pictish houses, and that sounds like it proved to be correct. Was there evidence of contemporary buildings around the Broch of the How of How, or was it all much later?
The buildings I showed you there in the lovely picture from Charles Tate was contemporary with the large Broch. When we took those away, there were other structures, probably contemporary with the thinner, smaller Broch inside, the larger one. It's very, very complicated, but yes, there were contemporary structures, and I'm sorry I didn't actually say that.
No, thank you very much. No, that's it's interesting to hear that. Thank you. Alistair,
okay. I will then ask you some questions from the YouTube chat. So Richard asks, how long did it take for John's interpretation of Brochs to be accepted? Is that, did he create a new consensus, or was his role more to question the previous consensus? I'm not sure what your thoughts are on that.
Well, that's a very difficult question, because at the end of last year, well, at the turn of the year, we lost 3 prominent archaeologists to do with Orkney, and Ewan Mackay was one of them, and his theories and John's differed immensely. I would say that John's theories about Brochs have prevailed. People are using his thinking, like Martin, to explore beyond, ask questions, and get away from the very traditionalist point of view. Although there will still be merits in some of what Ewan had been working with all his professional life.
My next question comes from Howie, who asks, he says that the traditional height of the tower combined with the commanding situation was thought to be for military advantage, and is that still the picture?
I would imagine for some Brochs, the answer is yes. There are other researchers, such as Brian Smith in Shetland, who thinks that they certainly were very much defensive. Some of these Brochs may have been a warning system. I mean, we're talking about the Roman period for some of them, not necessarily for all of them. So were they, watchtowers, all sorts of different things. They were obviously mostly built in places with commanding views.
So I think Bill also has a question to do with that, and it's to do with whether the surrounding houses around the broch could be barracks for villagers or defenders who worked locally but protected the broch and would retreat into it as necessary. I think you've outlined that theory kind of in your answer to the previous question. I don't know if you have any.
To a certain extent, from the evidence that we got from how it was very much a working village, shall I say, and the same for Gurness. People lived there. It just wasn't a refuge in the sense. When we talk about defence, yes, it's got all these defensive qualities, but people were living and working. There must have been fields around, certainly cattle, sheep, very much a working village.
One final question, I think, also from Richard. He asks, how much better are archaeological methods than when John was first excavating the Brochs in the 70s and 80s?
Well, I might surprise you by saying the methods have not changed. The technology's changed. We're now digital. You know, some of those photographs I had to slave over an old computer and slide scanner. Today, we can take digital images. We're using new forms or new methods of recording using satellite imagery, GPS, all sorts of things. But generally, since about the 1970s, the way we work has not changed very much. We take more scientific samples, we do more scientific research, only because the technology and science has moved on.
Right. So it's the methods are basically the same, but
they've developed, yes, but they are basically the same.
Okay. Okay, I think that brings our Q&A to a close there. Thank you to Beverley, to Heather, and to our audience at home. I'd also like to thank the tech team behind the scenes today. And I would ask you, if you are interested in this talk, there is the following memorial lecture, which starts at 5 p.m. And this will be a tribute to Dr. Raymond Lamb. All this year's events are free, but if you'd like to support the Science Festival, you can donate, and instructions are available on our website at oisf.org. Please do subscribe to the Orkney International Science Festival YouTube channel and like us on Facebook. Remember that you can join the festival club this evening from 9:30 p.m. to chat with the day's speakers in an informal setting, and the link for that is available on our website as well. For now, that's everything I have to say, and I will say thanks once again to all the participants, and goodbye.